evolution. So evolution or evolutionary, yeah, I'd say we're going to evolution, and then a subset of it is evolutionary processes. And further information, you go to evolution and evolutionary biology, the individual Wikipedia articles as always. All right, continue further. So a central organizing concept in biology is that life changes and develops through evolution, which is the change in heritable characteristics of populations over successive generations. Evolution is now used to explain the great variations of life on Earth. The term evolution was introduced into the scientific lexicon by Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck in 1809, and 50 years later, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace formulated the theory of evolution by natural selection. According to this theory, individuals differ from each other with respect to their heritable traits, resulting in different rates of survival and reproduction. As a result, or it should be as a result, so SIC for, or seek, yeah, for I copied and pasted as was from Wikipedia. So as a result, traits that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to be passed on to subsequent generations. That's very interesting. So Darwin was not aware of Mendel's work of inheritance, and so the exact mechanism of inheritance that underlie natural selection was not well understood until the early 20th century, when the modern synthesis reconciled Darwinian evolution with classical genetics, which established a neo-Darwinian, or any combination of natural selection and genetics, perspective evolution by natural selection. This perspective holds that evolution occurs when there are changes in the allele frequencies within a population of interbreeding organisms. In the absence of any evolutionary process acting on a large random mating population, the allele frequencies will remain constant across generations as described by the Hardy-Weinberg principle. And remember, alleles are gene variants. So let's go over here. So here's a diagram, MES note. Look at this diagram. So several major ideas about evolution came together in the population genetics of the early 20th century to form the modern synthesis, including genetic variation, natural selection, and Mendelian or gene inheritance. So what you have is this setup right here, 19th century Malthusian competition, so geometric population growth, limited resources. So basically, yes, supply and demand of scenario of population growing depending on the resources available. And then you have variations, you have breeds, races, subspecies of each of the populations. And then you have mutation here, mutation, small changes in individual characteristics. So this is subspecies, and this is actual individuals slightly changing. And then you have variation, goes into natural selection, and you have this Darwinian survival of the fittest, basically trying to get limited resources, and different breeds, subspecies, races, trying to compete and have different advantages. Yeah, now the next setup here, so you have mutation, small changes in individual characteristics. These lead to genetic variation of each of the individuals. So it's not just variation of breeds, races, of different subspecies, but actually the individuals of each subspecies itself is all varying depending on its genetic makeup and its mutations interacting with the individuals itself. So alleles of individual genes combining to give continuous variation. It's a variation of the actual individuals as a big spectrum, as opposed to just saying this subspecies is different from another one. So now the individuals itself of every subspecies is different from each other. So going further here, so you have Mendelian inheritance. So you have two copies of each parent, of each gene, or gene inheritance, and one from each parent. And then all these ideas put together, so survival of the fittest, natural selection, genetic variation of the alleles of individual genes are giving rise to continuous variation of every individual. And then you'll have Mendelian inheritance, where the copies of genes is given for one from each parent into each person. And then you combine this all together, you have the modern synthesis, or the early 20th century, bringing up what is the general framework for current genetic variation, just current evolutionary thought. So going further, allele frequency or gene frequency is the relative frequency of an allele or variant of a gene at a particular locus in a population, expressed as a fraction or percentage. For example, let's say 70% of humans have an X gene allele at a specific spot, and so on, for eye color, green or something. So specifically, it is the fraction of all chromosomes in the population that carry that allele. In population genetics, the Hardy-Weinberg principle, so going back over here, and this is right here. So in the absence of any evolutionary process acting on a large random mating population, the allele frequencies will remain constant across generations as described by the Hardy-Weinberg principle. Yeah, so going back here, so the Hardy-Weinberg principle, also known as Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, a model, theorem, or law, states that allele and genotype frequencies in a population will remain constant from generation to generation in the absence of other evolutionary influences. Yeah, so basically the percentage of those gene variants, such as for example, eye color, will remain at the same general percentage of a population if there's absence of any other evolutionary influence. So there's nothing else coming into play, such as a asteroid or something. So yeah, it's very interesting. So now here's an example of or a diagram of or illustration of natural selection for darker traits. So let's say you have this setup right here. So mutation creates variation. We have a gene that is yes, this is for types of just darker traits or skin color. So let's say you have this as a semi-dark skin color, then you have a mutation creates a white skin color right here. And then you have this medium one, and you have a dark one right here, and unfavored mutations selected again. So basically, let's say they can't survive, these white ones can't survive in the sun, etc. Then you're just going to remain these ones, and then a reproduction and mutation occur between these, and these have this different shades of the dark skin, for example, or darker traits, and reproduction and mutation occur. Then you have this setup now, so because you remove this one, and now these ones get so their offspring get something like this. Or basically a reproduction and mutation occur, and then favorable mutations more likely to survive. So let's say the darker ones more likely to survive. These ones die out, and now the next next reproduction also and slash variation slash mutation. You may have, for example, here they reproduce. You get another spectrum like this. You notice how it's getting darker and darker. These ones aren't surviving the sun. Just an example of dark skin and sun. And then these ones that gradually aren't dying either, and you're just left with a spectrum of darker individuals or darker traits, and so on. So yes, it's an illustration of it. So natural selection for darker traits, and that's combining the idea of mutations as well of the actual individual genes. So you combine these all together, so variation, and you also have this survival of the fittest concept. All right, continue further. So another process that drives evolution is genetic drift, which is the random fluctuations of allele frequencies within a population due to random sampling from one generation to the next. When selective forces are absent or relatively weak, allele frequencies are equally likely to drift upward or downward at each successive generation because the alleles are subject to sampling error. This drift halts when an individual becomes fixed, either by disappearing from the population or replacing the other alleles entirely. Genetic drift may therefore eliminate some alleles from a population due to chance alone. Yeah, so basically it's saying that you actually have a setup where just by the random chance, you can actually eliminate some alleles from a population just due to strictly chance alone, because you have up and down movement, etc. Or you eventually may get to a scenario where the up and down movements randomly just goes in one direction, and then it does not get back to the other alleles. So such as this one, but this is in this case unfavorable mutations selected against. But you might just have a setup such that it just keeps getting the darker ones, and then there's no more of the white ones. It's just randomly gone out. So that's genetic drift there. And yeah, this sampling error here. So when selective forces are absent or relatively weak, allele frequencies are equally likely to drift upward or downward at each successive generation because the alleles are subject to sampling errors. So sampling errors are incurred when the statistical characteristics of a population are estimated from a subset or sample of that population. Yeah, so in terms of biology, this basically means the sampling errors basically means, for example, if you have a population of animals and then a few of them migrate, well, that's going to be affected by a sampling error, because that few that is migrating is not going to be it's not always going to be fully representative of the initial population. So here's an illustration of that. So genetic drift results from random sampling error. So if you had, for example, here a population here 50% red and 50% white, if you just take a handful, for example, let's say animals are migrating to some specific location. So those ones that are migrating, in this case, let's just take a small sample. You're going to have, for example, 100% red, 0% white. So that is some genetic drift. So you've completely eliminated all of the white beads there. But if you take a bigger sample, you're more likely to get more representative ones, such as this 51% red, 49% white. So sampling error is higher with smaller sample. All right, and here's another example of genetic drift right here. Again, just random fluctuations in it. For example, if you have some rabbits right here, these are the brown ones. The brown gene is the capital B, and it's the dominant one. And then the lowercase b is the white allele or gene, etc. And so it's the recessive one. So you need both of these for it to be white, BB, lowercase b. But if there's any capital B, it becomes brown. And so initially you have exactly 50% of the probability. You have exactly 50% of the lowercase b in all of these, and 50% capital B. And then, but let's just say randomly, only 5 of these rabbits reproduced. So because that random chance you just had 5 of them reproduce, what ends up happening in this population, let's say one of these dies off, some of them die off, etc. If these are the only ones reproducing, you're only going to have basically in this case, there's only going to be one white recessive rabbit or bunny there. So then let's say that's the second generation. So in this case, if you count all these up, you're going to have 70% with the P or the B gene. Yeah, the P is just that's probability for the capital B gene. Initially it was 0.5, now it's 0.7. Another one's dropped to 0.3. And then let's say these 2 rabbits reproduce. So now the third generation, you're going to have basically and this one eventually is going to eliminate all of and let's say the other ones die off. And these are the capital B and capital B. So in other words, you've completely removed the lowercase b just randomly because just those brown ones were the ones reproducing, and now you have the second generation only the having both of these genes reproduce. So then you have all of these are just the same brown bunnies with the capital B genes. And another example, another evolutionary process is the bottleneck or population bottleneck or genetic bottleneck is a sharp reduction in the size of a population due to environmental events such as famines, earthquakes, floods, fires, disease, and droughts, or human activities such as speciescide, or basically large-scale elimination of a species. Yes, specieside. All right. And also widespread violence or intentional culling and human population planning. Yes, you have a bunch of mechanisms in there. So here's an illustration of it. So let's say an original population, they had a bottleneck event, some extreme event, and that basically only a few were able to get out, and this is a surviving population. So that's going to be basically pretty much an example of, I would say genetic drift, but it seems more like an extreme case of genetic drift. But yes, so that's pretty much it. Yes, if you have a population of few survive, and it's going to be just a random sampling of it, or that they were the only ones able to survive, etc. But regardless of random or not, you have a small subset and so on. And going further, there's one more thing. Here's another one: is population bottleneck is followed by recovery or extinction. So typically, what happens if you have population size is a bottleneck event, and it's either it goes down, and then you either have just an extinction, they can't survive, or there's eventually going to be a recovery. So it's interesting as diagram there. And also, lastly, the culling, as I mentioned here, this one right here, droughts or human activities, widespread violence or intentional culling. So in biology, culling is the process of segregating organisms from a group according to desired or undesired characteristics. In animal breeding, it is a process of removing or segregating animals from a breeding stock based on a specific trait. It's interesting stuff there.